Finally, in the struggle, he thought maybe I'll spear him with a stick. That's not working either. Finally, as they're struggling, the man finds himself on top of the lion, and he basically puts enough pressure on his throat until the lion dies. And that's how he won the day. Now, I pity this man's wife in the future. I mean, he can do no wrong after that. I mean, not only being the king of the castle, he fought and beat and killed a lion, for crying out loud. What else would you want me to do? How much could I prove myself after defeating a lion? What's interesting here is that David, from his victories in the past, he's able to predict what God is going to do in the future. He remembers his story of the lonely shepherd defeating lions and bears in the wilderness. And he says to himself, if God could help me there, God could certainly help me over here. All right? It is the fat panda against the evil leopard Tai Lung. It is the story that we know as David and Goliath. And what I realized this week in preparation is the situation is worse than I really thought. David does not face one giant in the story, but he actually faces three that we're going to be looking at today. He faces one big, ominous giant and two others that can be equally as devastating, but not so obvious. In fact, the entire part of the story of David is about looking beyond what is obvious, about what you can see. If I had a little bit more time today, I would go into a few of the scriptures, but if you remember today in 1 Samuel 16, even when they began when they selected David as the next king, remember, Samuel goes to the house, he lines up, Jesse lines up all the sons, he's like, this guy has got to be the guy, right? Eliab is big, he's the oldest in the house, he looks amazing, and God says, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And so really what we see for 2 chapters is God trying to show us through various ways and how differently we sometimes look at the world and then how God actually looks at you and I. So David is chosen. Samuel examines all the other family candidates. He runs out of sons. David the youngest. He's not even considered. He is out in the fields doing his own thing. They didn't even think to bring him in, and they bring him in. And what's interesting is this is now in verse 12 it says he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Now, no one uses the word ruddy today. It's often translated to suggest that David may have had red hair. Other references in the Bible indicate this was probably a quality of health or the color of his skin. Whatever it is, it's something that Samuel notices in chapter 16. Goliath notices in chapter 17. Now, what's interesting here is that what God sees as a sign of strength and beauty, David's family sees as something negative. Because David is different. His family views this as embarrassing. He doesn't look like he even belongs to the same family as the rest of them. And now he goes from being included or excluded in the selection process to being chosen as king instead of all his brothers. Now, before we get to the story of David and Goliath today, it's clear that David has a strong understanding of who he is despite the competing voices of those around him. What you're going to see time and time again in this scripture is how David remains true to who he is while everyone else around him, important voices, powerful voices in his life around him, say something different. This is a critical step in our emotional health that we're going to be speaking of today. The resource that we're using in the study that Stephanie mentioned, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, describes this in a word called differentiation. We're going to put that up on the screen. Developed by Murray Bowman, differentiation is the ability to know who you are and who you are not. It is having the maturity to be who God has called you to be when the forces around you expect or demand something different. And your level of healthy differentiation is basically based on 2 things very quickly. Number 1, your ability to maintain godly values and goals apart from the pressures around you. So even if someone else says that you want to be this way, even if everyone else expects you to be a certain way, you remain true to who God has called the values, the goals that God has set up in your life. And the second thing is your ability to maintain godly relationships with those who are most important to you, even if they disagree with your values and goals. So you're able to maintain not only a healthy sense of who I am, but even if you and I disagree, I can still love you, I can still respect you, I can still have a relationship with you, even if we disagree on some pretty major things. And what we see time and time again, especially in the family of faith in the Christian community, are two extremes of this level of differentiation. For some, we have people that are truly God-centered, and their values and their goals are pretty much set, but because they don't have a healthy level of differentiation, they can't accept anybody that doesn't agree exactly the way they agree, or believe exactly the same way that they believe. Or we have other people who want to agree with everybody on every single thing, and they really don't know who they are. They're really not centered in Christ, in their values and goals, and who they know they are, and who God has created them to be. And so much, even within the church family, we sometimes see two extremes of this thing called differentiation. Now, differentiation is so important for our emotional and our spiritual maturity. The reason is that if you spend most of your time, effort, and energy trying to be what everyone else expects, you will never become the person God has called you to be. If you spend all your time listening to all the other voices around you, you may never hear what the Creator has designed you to be. That's why the second step in this emotionally healthy spirituality is called know yourself that you may know God. Know yourself that you may know God. And the more I listen to His voice and understand my purpose, is the more I know God and I'm able to follow Him. So at a young age, David had a high level of differentiation. In the face of giants and judgment, David remained true to himself and to God. So let's examine the three giants that David faced in the passage, and which happen to be the three most common giants that you and I face on a regular basis. The first giant that I find in this passage is the giant of popularity. The giant of popularity. As chapter 17 begins, Israel is being attacked by the Philistine army. And as was common in their day, opposing armies would choose one warrior, one fighter from the armies to fight in single combat. 40 days, Goliath, the Philistine champion, challenged any man in Saul's army. The giant challenged the honor of God, Saul, and the armies of Israel. And for 40 days, no one answers the call. The three oldest brothers of David were among Saul's army. Because their elderly father was worried, he sent David to the front lines for his brothers and to get news to bring back home. And David, who had no experience in the battlefield, could not believe what he was seeing and hearing. His questions in verse 26 lead me to believe that he was wondering if the king's reward was what was holding back the next champion. Like he was thinking, listen, maybe the king is not offering enough for someone to risk their life to go into battle. And so he asked 2 or 3 times in the passage of Scripture exactly what the king is offering. And he was offering an amazing reward. More riches than he could think about. The king's daughter in marriage and no taxes forever. That'd be worth. I'd really consider, even though I'm not a fighter, I'm like, hey man, I would consider that. No taxes forever for the rest of my life. I am down with that. Let me even think about it. But no one is considering this offer. In David's mind, it was clear that God was waiting on someone to step up so God could display His strength and might in the face of the Philistines. This is when David faces his first giant in the voice of his bigger, older brother, Eliab. 1 Samuel 17, 28 through 30 says the following. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. Notice the family dynamics here. David doesn't do much to spark the anger of Eliab. Why are we so impatient with those that we claim that we love? Why do we show more respect and honor and love towards those on our job and out in the streets rather than people within our own homes? To be fair, no one knows the responsibility that Eliab had as the older brother of the family. And to be honest, there could have been part of him trying to guard David's life. Unlike the differentiation of David, Eliab probably doesn't understand where his protection of David begins, or where that ends in his pride against David begins. But in his anger, Eliab immediately questions the thinking and motives of David's heart. We'll be talking more about family next week. I want to encourage you to come back next week. We're talking about family stuff next week. You need to be here next week if you can. But no one has the greater power on earth to lift you up or bring you down more than your family. Can we be honest? It is obvious that this is not their first confrontation either. David doesn't just say, hey, what have I done? He says, what have I done now? Well, what have I done this time? This is not the first conversation. Clearly, it's not the first conversation that they probably had, and they've probably been repeating the same conversation time and time again. Eliab represents the giant of popularity in David's life. Now, don't misunderstand me. David is not seeking fame at this point. Popularity is not only the temptation to crave the applause of others, but to define who I am by other people's opinions. All right? So it's not that David is going out seeking this fame, seeking popularity through killing this giant, but through the eyes of Eliab, he is tempted to define himself by what his older brother thinks of him rather than what God thinks of him. It's still the giant of popularity, it's just in a different form. The only people more important in David's life are God and his parents. Eliab's voice matters. His words have weight. David is faced with a giant of measuring up to Eliab's expectations or God's designs. And you may not desire to be popular in this room, but you may still be facing the temptation to base your worth or your purpose on somebody else's opinion. That's the giant of popularity. The second one, because we'll run out of time. I ran out of time in the first service. I'm probably going to do it this one as well. The second one is the giant of possessions. King Saul represents the next giant that David confronts. We learned last week that Saul was not only tall, but he was the first king of Israel. Saul was not only a man, he was a symbol in Israel. And like Eliab, Saul judged David on his appearance and his experience. David did not fit the ideal image of Israel's champion. Saul is quick to point out that Goliath has more experience on the battlefield than David has experience in life. David now has to convince Saul that he can defeat Goliath based on his moments of victory as a shepherd against lions and bears. About 2 weeks ago, I read it this week. It happened, I believe, 2 weeks ago. But there was a story that came out of Colorado recently of a guy that he was running on a hiking trail in Colorado mountains on a very, on a supposedly a safe thing. He heard some rustling of leaves behind him and found himself being chased by a mountain lion. The mountain lion catches up with him and begins to attack, and in defense, he puts his arms up like this. The lion grabs on his arm and will not let go. They begin tumbling down the mountain with this lion held on to his arm as strong as he can. As they're struggling, he finds a rock. He begins hitting the lion's head with a rock, and the lion will not let go. Finally, in this struggle, he thought, maybe I'll spear him with a stick. That's not working either. Finally, as they're struggling, the man finds himself on top of the lion, and he basically puts enough pressure on his throat until the lion dies. And that's how he won the day. Now, I pity this man's wife in the future. I mean, he can do no wrong after that. I mean, not only being the king of the castle, he fought and beat and killed a lion, for crying out loud. What else would you want me to do? How much could I prove myself after defeating a lion? What's interesting here is that David, from his victories in the past, he's able to predict what God is going to do in the future. He remembers his story of the lonely shepherd defeating lions and bears in the wilderness. And he says to himself, if God could help me there, God could certainly help me over here. Now what's interesting is Saul finally gives David his approval, but only sort of, kind of. He says in the passage of Scripture, the Lord be with you. That's like the Lord bless you. That's like God help him. That's like, he kind of approves of what's going on, but not really. Listen to verse 38 through 40. Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head, clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. He tried in vain to go, but he had not tested them. He can't even move at this point. And David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. He took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. While Saul gives his approval to David, he immediately begins to weigh him down with the possessions of the king. He receives David with his lips, but he doesn't accept him for who he is. So he dresses him in his armor. And since this was customized armor, this was like, teenagers, this was like a custom skin for a guy in Fortnite or something. It was his armor made just for him. Someone suggested, it's interesting, someone suggested when I was reading that he was trying to dress David in his armor in order for others to think that Saul won the battle and not David. But after honoring the king's request, David takes off the armor because he has not tested him. In other words, this armor didn't get David to this point, and it wouldn't help him to face the next giant. And guys, that is the allure and the lie of possessions in our lives. Now, guys, there's nothing wrong with having nice things until those possessions begin to give us a false security in ourselves and less dependence upon God, who gave us those to begin with and got us to that point to begin with. And guys, it's not just about money either. I know people who have completely changed when they got a certain job. They came to church. They were crying out to God for 8 months, for 2 years. We prayed that they would get a job. And as soon as they got a job, they didn't need God anymore. They didn't need you and I either. Right? I know others who treat their spouse or their children like a possession. They love the Lord, but they would sacrifice their God-given values and purpose to please a child that will never be happy with what they provide. David would be a very successful man, but his possessions would not get him there, especially against this next giant. The final giant is the most obvious one. We reach the summit of the story and face this most obvious giant in Goliath, the giant of performance. Seems like we've touched on this issue the past 2 weeks. In week 1, we talked about the unhealthy symptom of doing for God instead of being with God. Last week, we talked about using God to run from God. This is when we use activities in the name of God, Christian service, acts of compassion, etc., to avoid dealing with our emotional and spiritual immaturity. At some point in our lives, we all face the giant of performance. This is the temptation to value myself or my relationship with God based on what I do. We do this when we base our value on our job or how much money we make. We face the giant of performance when we base our relationship with God on what we do for Him. Performance-based people also face the temptation to develop friendships based on what we can get from them. And then we get disappointed when they burn out because they have nothing left to give. I had more to say, but I'm going to move on. With this in mind, listen to 1 Samuel 17, 41 through 47. It says, the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Very quickly. In ancient warfare, there are three basic types of soldiers. Okay? And in most ancient warfare, there are three types of guys that fight. The first one are cavalry, or cavalry, that's the word I'm trying to go for. What are those kind of guys? Those guys are on horse or chariot. They're up above, and they're fighting that way. Then, typically, you have infantry. These are foot soldiers who fought hand-to-hand combat with swords, shields, spears, etc. And then you have all artillery, those who are skilled fighters with slings or bow and arrow. Now, with this in mind, what kind of champion was Goliath? He's infantry. He's the guy that fights hand to hand. He's bigger than anybody else in the room. You get close to him, you get clobbered. That's what he is about. Some experts believe that with this in mind, it's not only true that he was a champion because of his strength and size, but they believe that he called David close due to his poor eyesight. Some believe that he was led down the valley by the shield bearer because he can't see very well. And this is why David tells him to come to me, because of his poor vision and maybe his double vision. He says, am I a dog that you would come at me with sticks, when he only has one stick in his hand? Now, the giants of performance that we regularly face, but you listen to this carefully, not only tempt us to value ourselves based on what we do, but these giants lead us to live our lives and fight our battles in ways that we were never created to fight. David wins the battle, not only because of his faith in God and his skill with stones and sling, but because he understands how God has designed him to fight. Because of his understanding of who God created him to be, he clearly understands God's message and purpose for his life. Now that's differentiation. That's how he is not drawn into fighting the battle Goliath's way. And how many of us are living with spiritual and emotional wounds because we fought in ways that God never created us to fight, never called us to fight, nor ever equipped us to fight.